Good day. It has been stated that any chord can go to any other chord. There's no rule that says you can't do that. And that was never truer than when William Thomas Strayhorn wrote Lush Life. Billy was born November the 29th, 1915. He composed Life is Lonely, later to be changed to Lush Life when he was all of the age of 16. A musical protege who ended up as a composer and arranger in the shadow of Duke Ellington. He composed such classic songs as Satin Doll, Take the A-Train, among many other dozen titles. I believe Ellington inadvertently shone a little light on the truth when one night, when he was addressing his audience, said to them, "Well, Strayhorn does a lot of the work, but I take the bows." I'm going to provide for you a complete analysis of the musical intricacies of Lush Life. It's quite astonishing how many different creative elements went into the composition of this work, and therefore this tutorial will be in two parts. Welcome to part one. I'm going to be using such terms as chromatic, tritones, equal division of the octave, tonicization, aka secondary dominance, inharmonic equivalent, and modes. If you're not familiar with this terminology, unfortunately, you won't be able to follow this tutorial. But the good news is that all these topics are covered through my website, www.davidburt.com. Particularly, check out primary and secondary chord movements and also tonicization. Another option you might consider is to view this tutorial with a knowledgeable instructor, where the video can be paused for further explanation. So let's get right to it, and we'll look at the first 7 bars of Lush Life. Yes, you heard me right. 7, not 8 bars. However, I believe you won't miss not having the 8th bar, since the sentence remains in balance. Let's give it a listen. Now, just before we get down to analyzing the music, I'd like to bring your attention to chord symbol notation. In the key of C, the 1 chord, of course, is C, and the 2 chord is D minor. If I make that a flat 2 chord, it becomes D flat. So the minor chord becomes major after it's been flattened, but notice the letters remain the same. When we look at the 7 chord in C major, it's B diminished. And if we were to flat the 7 chord, it becomes B flat major. Again, the letter remains the same. However, a problem becomes apparent once we find ourselves working in keys containing 5 or more sharps and flats. Observe the key of D flat in which we're working in. Of course, the 1 chord is D flat, not a problem there. The 2 chord, E flat minor. When I flatten the 2 chord, it becomes major, and the letter must remain the same, but I don't think we really want to work with a chord symbol like an E double flat, so we use a practical inharmonic equivalent D. I think the musician would prefer looking at a D chord symbol rather than an E double flat chord symbol. The same problem presents itself when we go to the 7 chord. Well, the 7 chord in D flat is C diminished. The flat 7 chord becomes C flat. This letter remains the same. However, we don't like really using C-flat chord symbols any longer, so the practical inharmonic equivalent, we would use B. Now, some publications still use the C-flat chord, which, by the way, is the correct notation, but for practical purposes, I use B, and so do most other people. Now let's take a look at the music of Lush Life. Here's a 4-bar intro that I wrote. I'm not going to go into analyzing it, but you can see that I picked up on some of the composer's considerations, such as chromaticism and the same type of chords. Remember, an introduction is the last thing an arranger will write. Let's look at the first 2 bars. We start off on a 1 chord, D flat 6 in this case, and go to the flat 7 chord on the 3rd beat, B7, and back to the D flat major 7 chord. And then over here, not on the 3rd beat, but on the 4th beat, we have the flat 7 chord again, which kicks us back into the D flat chord on bar 3. Normally the chords do change on the 1st and 3rd beats. If I were to bring this chord back over onto the 3rd beat, if the chords all changed on the 1st and the 3rd beat. Nothing wrong with that if Strayhorn hadn't had something else in mind. And he did have something else in mind. If we look at bar 4, we can see there's a chord sequence starting with a 1 chord and a 2 chord and changes on every beat. So he kicks it off with the B7 chord, the flat 7 chord, into that sequence. If he had that over on the 3rd beat, it just really wouldn't work too well. So you need that as a kicker. Why did he do it over here in bar 2? Probably a little bit of foreshadowing of what's to come. So what is happening musically here? Billy Strayhorn uses 2 sequences to advance his music forward. It's based on a diatonic harmonic walk-up between 2 different major scales. I'm going to drop it into C major, which should make it easier for you to observe. So if I walk up from my 1 chord to the 4 chord in C major, it would be like this. A 1 chord, 2 chord, 3 chord, 4 chord. If I were to do the same thing in E flat major, well, E flat would be my 1 chord, 2 chord, 3 chord, and 4 chord. Now Strayhorn doesn't use that whole sequence, he uses part of it. He starts off on a flat 7 chord. Well, B diminished is my 7 chord, B flat is my flat 7 chord. So the sequence starts off on the flat 7 chord as a kicker, to the 1 chord, the 2 chord, and at this point he goes up a half tone and starts the sequence in a new key, in this case E flat. 1 chord, 2 chord, 3 chord. When I add the extensions for those chords, let's move it back into D flat. D flat is the only key to play this song in. So here's my 1 chord in D flat, my 2 chord. Now I'm going to go up a half tone, go into E major. This is my new 1 chord, to my 2 chord, F sharp minor, to my 3 chord, G sharp minor. My kicking chord is the flat 7 chord, B. So it's going to go B, up into D flat, E flat minor. Now I move into E major, 1 chord, 2 chord, 3 chord. And here's what it sounds like. When we finish our sequence, chords changing on every beat, we get to G sharp minor 7th. I'm using the inharmonic equivalent A flat minor 7, but in either case, you couldn't be further away from D flat. So he's got to scramble back. He only has a bar and a half to get back to the tonic chord. So he uses a wonderful device called equal division of the octave. He goes down 3 whole tones to D9, which is a distance of a tritone. So he sits on D9, which ends up being just below our 2 chord, E flat minor 7. So we step up to E flat minor 7, and voila, we're on the 2 chord. He decides to use the flat 2 chord rather than the 5 chord, and slides nicely into our tonic chord. The D flat 9 adds 6 back in the key of D flat. Coming into the first and second ending, we end up on a 2-chord E flat minor, and the composer decides to go through the flat 2 and onto the 1 chord. Of course, he could have used a 5-1 because the flat 2 and the 5 chords share the same tritones. It would have sounded like this. Not bad, but I still prefer the flat 2 approach. And as a review, the tritone. Remember, between the flat 2 and the 5 chord are 3 whole tones. There's my tritone. And here's the tritone on my 5 chord. Of course, it wants to go to the 1 chord. The same tritone works on the flat 2. So they're totally interchangeable. In fact, we can use both the 5 and the flat 2 chord. Doesn't mean that it's any better, it's just a possibility. Let's listen to that. After the second ending, we move into F minor, 4 flats. That is presuming that it's based on the Aeolian mode. So here we use a regular 2 chord to a regular 5 chord, which will take us into F minor. Sometimes the G diminished chord is dropped altogether to allow the D flat chord to drop a half a tone directly onto the 5 of F minor. However, we could have the best of both worlds if, for example, the G diminished chord into a second inversion. In that way, the diminished fifth would fall a half tone onto the 5 of F minor. Here we are in F minor. But on closer examination, I see a D natural. It tells me that we're not in the Aeolian mode at all. We're in the Dorian mode because that looks very much like a Dorian 6. So now we're in F Dorian, which is only 3 flats. Doesn't change the key signature over here because the composer looks after that by putting a natural sign on all the 6s to keep it Dorian, and avoids G flat altogether by just outlining the F minor 6 chord with a C, D natural, F, A flat, and C. Further proof that we are in the Dorian mode is the use of this 2 chord, the G minor chord. Both the G minor and the G diminished chord can be used as a 2 chord going into, in this case, F minor. But we know it's Dorian because the G minor does not have a D flat in it, it has a D natural. So here we have 2, 5, and into the 1 chord again. And then in bar 6 of this whole sequence, he briefly brings us back into the F Aeolian mode by reintroducing the D flat. It's very brief, but it gets us on the track back into the key of D flat. I'm using melodically F minor 7. There's the Dorian 6 stuck there, and then it becomes part of the melody as right there. Then the turnaround to get back into F minor, 2 of F minor to the 5 of F minor. Starts over again. This time, he goes back to the Aeolian mode and picks up the D flat, not the D natural. Coming out of the F minor sequence, we see that we go through a 7 chord, the E diminished, and another half tone down to the 2 of D flat. So a chromatic move at that point, which takes us to the 5. At this point, Strayhorn could have gone into the next section. Let me explain that on the piano, and we'll finish up this section. When the composer comes out of the F minor sequence, he could have decided this is probably the time to move into the next section. I'm glad he didn't do that, but it could have sounded like this. That's my 7 chord of F minor onto the 2 chord of D flat to the 5 and started into the new area. That would have been a shame because we would have lost 6 very nice, interesting bars. So let's listen to how it should be. It's a 7 chord, the 2 in D flat, E flat minor, to the 5 chord, and then he does a neat leap. And at this point, we're not really sure where he is. I can look at that and say, well, it's a B dominant chord. In this case, a B9 plus 11. Would appear it's the flat 7 chord, but we don't hear it as that. Now here's where it gets a little tricky, and see if you can bear with me. He drops at a half tone onto a B9 chord. B is the root of the 6th chord in D flat, which should be minor. But the fact that he drops it onto a dominant chord, this now loses the 6th chord quality and becomes a 5 of the 2 chord. Not surprisingly, it goes exactly there. To the 2 chord. And he still is stalling for time. So he does another equal division of the octave. He goes up 3 whole tones, 1, 2, 3, equal division of the octave into the A chord. And then he does equal division all the way back to the 2 chord and slides very nicely through the flat 2. And now we finally get to hear the new section. But that is for part 2. Don't forget you can pause the video and look at some of the things that I've told you about. I'll look forward to continuing with you on analyzing the music of Billy Strayhorn's Lush Life.